So I'm James Georgilakis. I'm the Director of Evidence and Impact here at IDS, and very happy to be asked to chair this members' seminar. We had a wonderful presentation on this research to our Board of Trustees the other day, and they got really excited about it, and they could really see its relevance and its potential. So delighted to share it with all of you now. So Annabelle Marin is the head of our business markets and state cluster, and Gabrielle Palazzo is joining her today, who worked on this research with Annabelle. And it is a world's first. Okay, that's always exciting because according to the promotional literature, this is the first systematic global mapping of civil resistance and mineral extraction, which is amazing. And it caught my attention because, and I have to declare my slight bias here, I really love to see research which draws upon a corpus of media articles. I think that's super interesting. And I remember we talked about the methodology long back time ago, and it's super relevant to so many other issues that we work on at IDS. So I'm going to pass over to the team who are going to give you a presentation, and there'll be lots of time at the end for discussion and questions. Thank you.
So I go there. Thank you for the introduction. So I will present, but this is work we did together with Gabriel. Required very intensive data gathering, as you will see. So Gabriel was central to the work. He did most of this part. I have this one. So just before starting to present this, that is a particular paper, just to mention, I would like to mention more in general why we are so interested in the phenomena of civil society resistance. And the more we do research on this and we learn more and more about it, we just started to think about the parallelisms between the role that civil society resistance could play at the moment in terms of reshaping, redirecting processes in a context in which we know the labor movements and the role of unions have been challenged by economic changes, like because of the digital economy, and at the same time, the resources that they're supposed to be, we should be using less resources. We are using more, and resources are becoming central for the digital economy, the energy transition, and so an interesting question for us, which is also interesting historically, is to what extent civil society resistance at the moment might be playing roles in reshaping the system as labor movements did in the past. Of course, there are some parallelisms, but also very significant differences. So we are very interested in this phenomenon more in general. But what I will present now here is the work we have done in relation to civil society resistance to mining. And this is a paper that have just been, now it's a working paper and yes, IDS, but also been recently accepted to be published in the environmental research letter. So we're very glad because it's an open source. So let me start with so first I will explain why we think it's such an important topic, in this case, more specifically in relation to mineral extraction. Then what is known already, which are the gaps, and what we are then so contributing with this research, a bit about methods. The section of methods, we could be a whole presentation talking about that. So we decided that we just do a very brief introduction, and then if in the questions there is people interested in the details of how we did the data work, then we will explain, of course. Then the main empirical findings, conclusions, and I will finish with some of the new research questions that we are developing in a new research proposal and some ideas more general for a research center that also were discussed a few weeks ago in a workshop that we did on critical minerals and development. So that will be the presentation. So why is so important? Critical minerals is becoming more and more obvious that they will be central. They are central and they will be more for the energy transition. The green and also the digital economy are very resource intensive. In association with energy transition, we know that there will be increases by 4 times, so the estimations are that there will be increases by 4 times by 2040 or 500%, and there are many estimations around how much the energy transition will be relying on minerals. But we also know that minerals are embedded multiple global political, environmental, and territorial struggles. Some of the challenges that are receiving more and more attention, and I'm sure you have heard about recent developments in terms of the geopolitical tensions and what these tensions are leading to in terms of assuring this access to these resources, because one thing that happened with the critical minerals, they are even more concentrated than oil. And so this is very problematic because for some of them, just a few countries have the resources, but also the experience of extraction. That is not a minor issue. So there are multiple geopolitical tensions, but at the same time, these are being dealt with to some extent with different kinds of initiatives. Also, of course, multiple environmental problems in association with mining, different to other kind of environmental problems. The issue with mining is that they are more local. So that's why, because they have received less attention than, for example, the ones related to oil extraction. But still very problematic and becoming more central now because of the issue of the energy transition. Traditionally, we know that because they are resources, they have all the problems of the resource that already the literature on resource course has pointed out. So people is already talking about a new green resource course in associated with the re-specialization of countries on these sectors, issues of governance. And so, but one question that is the one we explore in this paper is, what if people said no, reject the expansion of mineral extraction? Because in previous research, I've been working for some time in Argentina and Chile, collecting more, looking at these two specific cases, then at Peru with Jose, and then looking more closely to the experience of some specific countries, we found out that the resistance to mineral extraction was having an impact on the viability of the project that was not being really considered centrally to the level that we thought it should be. So then we thought, okay, let's have a look to if this is something that is only happening in a few countries, or is something of a global scale, because it's a very different thing, basically. And I will go back to this question. So our kind of motivation question is, okay, what happens if on the top of all the other challenges that are being more recognized, people reject the expansion of mineral extraction? And of course, the issue of the resistance is not new. It's already been there for a while, but it's gained with the kind of more recently, it has really gained prevalence and also momentum. So this is basically our motivation question. So what we know already about that, because this is an area of research that has received attention. So, but mostly from political ecology and looking at issues of justice. So there are a lot of research done on the problems of mineral extraction and resistance, very much looking at the effects of the mineral extraction on health, on the environment, on people's lives, and how people react to that. Also pointing out to the several injustices related to the fact that the benefits of extraction normally leave these local economies, but the people in the local economies receive most of the costs. So there is a lot of discussions about distributional issues of distributional procedural recognition injustice in association with this resistance to mineral extraction. And also there has been research on how much this resistance is changing institutions and policies, redistributing power, mostly at the local level. And also new narratives and post-extractivist ideas that are emerging in association with this resistance movement. So these are the kind of things that have been studied very well, I will say, through very multiple case studies and some efforts, but very isolated, of trying to map, but always national, regional. So the gaps are that much of this research is case-based and geographically concentrated. A lot in Latin America, because many of the researchers doing this work are Latin American. So we lack kind of global systematic analysis of the phenomenon. This is what we are trying to do in this paper. The other issue, as I said, there's been more focus on justice and power redistribution, but less on systemic effects of this resistance. So for example, much less attention on how they're affecting business, if business are changing, really their investment decisions, and also more on national and policies related to investment. So these are the things, but however, some of the research is already showing that this resistance it has economic impacts. It's a stopping project. When you start to look at the numbers, at the few, because we don't have really at the larger scale the numbers, but the kind of science we have around is that this resistance is impacting the economy, is stopping projects. In the case of Chile, where we did a more detailed study of all the mines, and which are involved in conflicts, and looking at the numbers and the scale of the investments affected, the numbers are really, really high. So, and then there are multiple examples of projects which have been completely blocked by this resistance. So, but nothing at a global scale. So again, the question is this a phenomenon that is a local scatter, or we are talking here about a global phenomenon with the potential that could then, if it's a global phenomenon, the transformative potential is completely different. And so we think that it changes significantly to have a global picture of the phenomena, to begin to understand the kind of impact they might have at a global scale, because it's the only way that there will be a larger potential for changes, for transformations, because many of these companies are global. So if they have the chance to move around localities, looking for places where they have easier to get the extraction is one thing, but then if really this has a global scale, then it gets more complicated. And this is what's happening. We know that companies are really struggling. When they want to start a project, the first problem they have, and they say it, is local resistance. They have to deal with that. So this might then have a potential to reshape norms and the industry practices to a level, and also to challenge the dominant institutions and technologies in the sector to a different scale than it has been up to now. So our work is precisely on trying to get this global systematic mapping as a first step to understand the impact of resistance in the system level, because of course this is our first work done with this data set. As I will show later, we have plans to expand it, and also others could do also other work that could expand this, but just this is enough to start to show the scale of showing the scale of the phenomena. We think it has a lot of contributes a lot to begin to understand this systematic impact. So the other thing we do is we use a data set based on the GDELT project of global news. So we address the regional biases of pre-existing mappings, like the most famous one is the environmental justice map, which is very much biased because it's self-reporting. So it's no way, I mean, things that have been written using this data to extract conclusions about distributions, they're not really, they're not good. So this is something that we address. And something that also we do that has not been done before is that we look at conflicts and cooperation events. So in the same locations where we have the conflict, because the data allow us to do that, we also could look at cooperation events. So this is the work that Gabriel put together, very detailed slides about how the data was collected. I'm not going to detail now, but if there are questions, please ask them, because actually we are very happy with the work that we did, and it was very intensive work, and it requires a lot of time and discussions and also time. So please, if you want, we can discuss that. But I will go into the main results here. So first main result is about scale. We found actually 36,000, around 36,000 conflicts in 4,293 locations. Here, just for you to have an idea, is around 6 times more than the environmental Atlas of Justice. Yeah. So and this is the global distribution of the conflict. Just for you to have in mind, this is the distribution of mineral deposits. So basically what we are looking at here, we didn't put it here together, but if you look at the two maps together, is wherever you have deposits, you have conflicts. That's what the first thing that the map showed. And for us, this was like, okay, we're doing the things well here, because it really, it worked in this sense. And so, of course, the next finding that we have is that conflicts grow with the mineral deposits and are independent of income level. And when the paper came up as a working paper idea, there was some other estimation that also, I don't remember the name, but it was, yeah, saying exactly the opposite, like conflict is a problem of the poor countries, more or less. And then, no, actually, our work shows that this is not the case. It's this, and we really check here because we found this very interesting. Because of course, at the beginning, you see that they're all over the place. But then when you run a regression and put the income level and you control by other variables, you can look more to this question, and actually this is what we found. Then of course we could be a long time and people ask a lot of questions about which countries, but I'm not going to present that now. But of course, what I can say is that we control also, because these are English, these are news that have been translated to English, but we also control by non-English and English-speaking countries. The other interesting finding is that 57% of conflicts are highly polarized. And this means that so they involve disapproval, rejection, strong protests. We are not talking here about violent, necessarily, violent conflicts. There are some, actually, but they are not. I mean, most of the conflicts are strong. When we say highly polarized, is that they have material consequences. This is something that the data distinguish between material and non-material conflicts, and so we didn't use this name. We prefer to use polarized because it connects better with the literature, but actually, for you to understand is, well, they have material consequences or not. So 57% are polarized, and then if you use the case studies to understand this, the potential impact of this polarization is alarming in terms of the consequences, because we know that when the conflicts get polarized, they're very difficult to revert. It's very difficult to find a case in which the conflict polarized between communities and companies and government, and then the project can advance. So it's alarming for governments and companies, of course, not for the social movements that are resisting, but looking at the phenomena globally and the possibilities of this happening, well, is problematic, no? So, but the other is that, as I said at the beginning, we look also at cooperation. And we found that cooperation is also very common in the same places where we found conflicts. Again, here we could distinguish the ones that involve, we call them high commitment, low commitment. And again, it has to do with material consequences or no, because a lot of these cooperations are just conversations, visits, and so on. But some others are really involve policy changes, grants of rights. So material consequences, 21% of them were with high commitment. So obviously here, we couldn't explore it in this paper, but it raises very interesting questions about the links between conflict and cooperation and the implications of that. But also, what we found, checking at the probability of finding cooperation in different contexts of polarization, what we found is that in the areas where there are higher polarization of conflict, you have less likelihood to have cooperation in general. Yeah. Okay, so, and last finding that I want to show and share with you is about, we look, and we could, because the news allowed to look at the topics that are discussed in the news, and what were the issues that were under these conflicts and cooperation events. And so we were surprised. I didn't expect to find what we found, and is that the economic issues were top in the list. And that we found very interesting. Of course, governance, social, environmental also appear as very relevant, but still, like infrastructure, labor, business, taxes, all these things that appear very important, as very important in relation to the conflict and the cooperation event. So what we thought in relation to this issue is that economic concerns, particularly labor, infrastructure, distributional, are still central drivers of resistance. Of course, they are mixed with social and environmental issues, but I think what has been happening recently to emphasize the issues of procedural justice and other kind of issues, the economic issues tend to be neglected. And I think this is a mistake because things should be integrated. It's not because we want to emphasize the injustices we have to forget that people still is very much concerned about their labor and the economic issues that are raised in relation to this exploitation. So to think a bit more about how to integrate things rather than separate and exclude them when we study this phenomena, we think is important. So let me go to the discussion and then the conclusions. The first, of course, this is what we found is this widespread resistance, not only in poor or marginalized or countries with poor institutions, but in general. So this, in our view, reveals a new dimension of political and economic and sustainability of the transition. And that's what we find very interesting to think much more about, because what this resistance is doing is challenging policies decided by central governments that some time ago were accepted without too much questioning. And what is showing here is that the people now is rejecting massively in many areas and in many situations what the governments decide. And so this is a political problem. So the key driver is exclusion, not just social, but also economic and political exclusion. So this really, what we think is called for a radical rethinking about how decisions about investment projects should be done. We are very far from that. I mean, the only place in which citizens have a voice in decisions about investment projects are in the environmental impact assessments of the project. And it's very, very imperfect when the project has already been decided. So basically, and we are using here the word economic democracy rather than just participation, because we think that this is not just an issue of participation, as I said before, but also rethink the whole model of investment and also the economic issues in relation to these projects and how the people get involved into these projects. Then the second important thing in terms for us, thinking in the implications, is to start to think about conflicts as drivers of change. A lot of the research done think conflicts as something that is blocking, that is stopping, but actually what we can see and start to see in some emerging evidence, but also I think looking at this at the global scale, is that it could be a driver of change. So of course, it depends then how these conflicts are managed by governments or dealt with, deal with by governments, but it could be. And also because we show more concretely with other data that they can trigger cooperation. So still a lot of questions about that, what the implications, what actually this cooperation means in terms of real changes. But again, high commitment cooperation appears as an issue. So conclusions. Here, so the main point that this data is showing for us is that there is a questioning about who gets to decide how these resources that will be so central for the energy transition, for the digital transition, and in general, who decides how these resources are going to be used. This is a big thing that is being here challenged by civil society. The model in general excludes the ones that are more affected, and this is the problem. So we need to really rethink many things. Here we just put very general governance, but actually this is really going to many places. But the risk, and this is something that we saw in this photograph, is I did it in a previous presentation I did, because when I was preparing the presentation, this was happening in Argentina, when the new government, the right-wing government, was discussing precisely a new investment law in which they were kind of making it easier for companies to do whatever they want. And it was the repression in the Congress. And so basically here, of course, this resistance could lead to changes, but if then also could lead to these kind of situations if we get into more authoritarian government. So this is something that I think it should be, we should be trying to understand much better. So just to finish, we are working, this is the first analysis we did for a very short paper, but we are now developing a proposal in which we are going to explore what we always get asked. So please don't ask this. We don't know. We don't really know. But actually, what are the social, economic, political, and environmental characteristics, as well as film level, factors that affect this probability of conflicts. We have enough number of data here, and also we can cross the data set with multiple other data sets that will allow us to look at this question. We can look also international changes in international institutions that could have effect, because we also have some time, not a long period of time, but we have some. Then we can also relate it, and we are interested to some economic, like commodity price cycle and other economic issues. Also, of course, link much more, understand much better the link between conflict and cooperation, as I said before. And we also can say things about the actors, because we know the organizations, the actors, we can map, we can do network analysis. And we can also look at dynamics that we think are very interesting, and for example, contagious effects of conflicts. That is something that some of the case studies have shown. But for example, in the case of Argentina, it's a very famous case of a contagious effect, that a resistance movement that started in the south and that spread into the whole country, and now 7 provinces have forbidden mining in Argentina. So, but we want to see then if this can be observed at a larger scale. And so finally, and just tell you a little bit about the what we discussed, then beginning with this project, and in conversation with other colleagues at Sussex and in other universities in other countries, we organized a workshop to start to think about if there was enough interest for developing a larger, more ambitious research center, research proposal, looking at the issue of critical minerals and development with centrality of civic power. And then we thought after this workshop that yes, that it is a good moment to advance this idea. There was a lot of interest. We have more than 30 people from all the continents, very different disciplines and different sectors as well. And so why? Well, one reason is the multiple interrelated tensions, development tensions in association with critical minerals have not really been looked at. And most of the mineral activity is going to go to low and middle income countries, which already have development tensions that will be increased by this extraction if it grows. And if ignored, of course, there will be more risk of geopolitical tensions that will escalate. So, but we need a more integrated approach that look at the economic, environmental, and social issues and political together, rather than as separate things. That is what been done up to now. And an idea that we are more and more trying to develop and understand is the idea of economic sustainability, which should be linked to discussions about environmental sustainability, so we can really have an integrated approach. Of course, more perspective from the global south and cross-learning. I'm now very much involved in a lot of webinars and discussions about diversification and how we diversify from natural resources with African countries. And then I think, well, we have studied this for 20, 30 years in South America. We know a lot already. We're not starting from scratch here. But in these discussions, it seems like they are starting every time from scratch. And it's local content policies, bans, export bans. What we know for many, many years, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and much more data in its new use, because there is no cross-learning. A lot of these things are in Spanish, for example. So this is something that I think should be now addressed. And then, well, this was a presentation to the board, so why IDS could be the leader and because one, of course, there is a tradition of independent action-oriented research, bridging local realities with global, focusing on transformation and innovation, which is also something that is missing a lot in the discussions and in the approaches. It's like if companies are not going to change anything, so all the discussions are like assuming the companies will do always the same. And of course, also there is here IDS developing work in many different clusters and people working on justice and transition. So it's also a good reason why IDS could lead on that. So I will finish here so we can have a discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Annabelle. That was great. And yeah, bring on the Center for Critical Mineral Extraction and so on. I think, so what really struck me about this work is that, well, I was actually sitting reading your working paper while on the TV in the background was the White House announcement on tariffs. And I know this is probably not the question you want to be asked based on your last slide, but it will be interesting to see how that, what impact we see from protectionism and higher tariffs, particularly on low and middle income countries, will have on these conflicts around the extraction of critical minerals. I think what's really interesting is that by taking a more systematic approach than simply basing this on case study or case-based research, you've essentially come up with a whole different type of learning than we would normally perhaps see from similar research. Because it's systematic, because it's global, you've come up with some extraordinary things around the fact that the frequency of conflict is actually not higher in the global south. It's highest in places like North America. I noticed in your map, the UK was a dark blob of red. And that, I like that, because I think in development studies, we often get accused of othering the global south. We're always talking about the problems and the critical challenges faced by governments and people in the south. But this is not a problem unique to the global south by any means. And I think the fact you looked at conflict and cooperation is so interesting to me. And again, we have a bit of a default sometimes in development to focus on resistance, but perhaps less so on cooperation and how resistance can be a driver of cooperation. And I think that this idea that you're discovering that the main concerns for those who are resisting mineral extraction kind of in their backyard are often economic concerns, first and foremost, not necessarily purely environmental. Again, is a good reminder. I mean, I'm not an expert in this area. Maybe that was obvious to others, but it wasn't obvious to me. I think we often seem to frame it in the North or in research as we assume it's got to be all about environmental resistance, but it's about jobs and decent work and money and families. So thank you so much. Let's open it up, and I'll ask you to take the mic so the recording can pick you up. Who would like to start?
Thank you, Annabelle and Gabrielle. That is just incredible, and it's exciting that you're doing this. So I have a very specific question, and then I was just thinking about how you're framing the question and the question of the paper and what it's leading to. And I think eventually I sort of got there along with you. But initially what the question was saying wasn't saying clearly enough to me was what was somehow we were concerned about the sort of resistance as opposed to the sort of governance that is being created in that process. And where you landed up, and maybe this is more of a comment than a question, my next one I promise is a question, is where you want to go now, I realized, is a typology, what you could construct very nicely in your upcoming proposal is a typology of cooperation. And what are the different types of cooperation you get, but what are the two things that interact? There is the level of confrontation, or what you're calling polarization, and then the type of governance that counters in each case. And that's a variable that you don't have that much on right now. And yeah, I'm very happy to engage with you on that. But I think that's essentially exactly where your proposal has landed up, which is really exciting. I think there's a lot to be done there. My specific question is that I didn't quite understand the sides of the graph and what you're really measuring. There was a graph early on, and at some point, you don't have to do it immediately, but I did want to sort of really understand what's on that y-axis, which wasn't very clear to me. I'll leave it there, and I have a few other comments that we can get into at other points.
What is that one?
Do you want to answer now or take that one?
Yes, this one.
No, that's because it's a specific. I can respond.
I can respond as well.
Right.
So here is the chart, the correlation between the number of conflicts events, or the number in this one is the number of locations with conflicts per country, and in that one the number of conflict events per country, and the correlation with the number of mining deposits that they have. controlling.
That's on the x-axis, but
Yeah.
the voice and accountability
That
on
is,
the
we are
y-axis.
controlling, I mean, we're using the residual of the regression because we wanted to control our index for voice and accountability. It's hard to say because
What's the measure of voice and accountability?
it's the World Bank, measure of voice and accountability that they say that they're trying to keep track of press freedom. So because our data is built using
So you have a
newspaper
certification
articles,
type on the
yes,
y-axis.
we wanted to control for that, and also for if the country is an English-speaking country or not.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is great work, and yeah, exciting to see it where it's got to. So I had 3 points, but I think one of them I will leave because it was related to your question about your observation about the stuff we already know about local content. And so in other words, the economic is actually about choices about development. It's about exporting a primary commodity from a region versus adding value to it and creating high value jobs locally. And as you say, we kind of know that. So I want to have, so I have 2 questions. One is to both of you and one specifically to Gabriel. The question for both of you is where you see the role of, because you say the only place that communities have voice is in the EIA, but that's not always true because sometimes there's transnational legal activism. So, for instance, we've seen recent judgments in the High Court in London against the mining companies involved in tailings dam disasters in Brazil. I think Rio Tinto was also taken to court in the UK over the Bougainville case and so on. So where do you see the role of legal activism fitting into this kind of dynamic? Is it picked up in the database? In other words, if you pick up a newspaper story about legal action in London, but it's reference to a mining project in Brazil, does that make it into your database as part of the Brazil story? And then in relation to the database, Gabriel, your unit of analysis is the episode, right? Is that right? You have episodes of cooperation, you have episodes of conflict, or your unit of analysis is the mining project itself.
No.
It's event. I mean,
It's an event-based, but you can cross-reference the mining locality and the events. Because what I'm interested in is, I think it follows on from what James was saying about dynamics of cooperation and conflict. What would be very interesting is to trace patterns over time.
Yeah.
In other words, what contestation strategies then lead to high, what was your term for?
Commitment.
High commitment. In other words, all companies make promises when they do the EIA. Very few follow through on them. Do people have to kick off in order to get them to follow through on their promises? And can you trace that in the data? Can you cross-reference a sequence which goes from high conflict, high polarization to cooperation with a single project? Thank you.
do you want to answer?
Yeah, I could. Vamos.
Introduce yourself as well.
Hi, hello. I'm João from SPRU. Thank you for the presentation, both of you. I have actually 3 methodological questions. First one, I think it segues from the previous comment. What's your geographical unit of analysis? Because to what extent, the news piece reflecting a project or a conflict elsewhere is captured here, right? So you have, let's say, activisms in a major metropolis, but it reflects countryside development. That's where, activists are acting, but it's not necessarily where the community is developing, right? So how do you account for that? Also like transnational borders, so on. Second one is, I think you addressed previously here in terms of voice, but how do you control for autocratic versus democratic countries?
Sorry, again?
Autocratic versus democratic countries, because as we see from the map, certain regions are not going to have any kind of demonstration, but we will have projects that will be demonstrated against elsewhere, right? So to what extent political systems are not necessarily biasing, but affecting, how do you filter for those? And I guess the last one is a little bit in terms of how do you account for different legal systems in terms of rights to exploration, right? So we have different subsurface rights in different geographies. Sometimes it's tied to ownership or prior use. So legal components might be something that I'm just wondering, how do you account for those, right? So if you have economic incentives that's well aligned to the exploration, communities might be already prone to that. And
Yeah.
I think this is also connected to the idea of cooperation, right? So if the community is pro-exploration or extractives, that's something that you did.
Mhm.
Sorry, last one quickly. You accounted for the fossil extractives and filtering. I saw in your appendix how you remove that so that you only have critical minerals. But I'm also wondering, in terms of coal and some other processes where you have potential for extraction and reuse circular economic-wise of some of these minerals, right? So you might have some lithium or some of the processes that are coming from let's say, spent catalyst or that. So to what extent these kind of activities are part of your scope of critical minerals, right? So are we talking about de novo extraction or even repurposing as part of the way that these communities are engaging exploration of these minerals? Yeah, sorry for the so many questions. Thank you.
That's fine. You want to take some of these questions? No, stop. I'm trying to remember. I don't want, please let's respond because I will forget all the questions.
There is some
No, exacto.
there's some questions that are more or less related because are related with the kind of data that we have. So, for example, the transnational legal activism, we can track that because we have two databases that are linked. One, the unit of analysis is the newspapers articles. The other one are the events that are detected in those newspapers articles. So the thing is, in the newspaper database, we have the names of all the people and all the organizations mentioned in the news. So using that, we can more or less easily try to do like a social a network analysis, tracking which kind of actors are more likely to be involved in conflicts or in cooperation events, or how these actors appears in different kind of countries and so on. So it's like there is possibility to track that. So then that's also more or less answer the thing of how we detect events happening in countries that are not related with the newspaper's source. So that's why, I mean, the GDELT provide this data that what they try to do, I mean, an event is an action happening between one or two actors, and then try to track in which location this action is happening. So actually we have the location, I mean, they give you the location of the action, the location, and the location of the two actors that are involved in that event. Of course, the data is not perfect, no? So we know that the data could have some mistakes because some locations may be named in a similar way in different countries, so they can make some mistakes on that. Having the map that we have, seeing that most of the conflicts happens in places that we have mines, makes more or less us confidence that our data it's okay. But that's one thing. The other thing, I mean, checking about democratic and non democratic countries, we try, I mean, in this plot, we use this measure of voice and accountability. We try different kind of measure of democracy, autocracy, and different kind of, more or less, the results that we're looking in this paper were robust. What was the result? That the number of conflicts were not related with the GDP per capita, and that were related with the number of mines that has the country. Mm-hmm. So it was robust in that sense. We can play with different dummies and so on, so we can continue doing some that kind of things. The legal system, we didn't check about that. I guess if we have good data to try to identify different legal system, we can also work on that. And the last thing that I have about the critical minerals and oil and gas and so on. So actually we didn't focus only on critical minerals. We focus on all mining, excluding oil and gas. And it's not like we exclude all the newspapers that are related with oil and gas. We excluded when the topic appear at the beginning of the news, because we're trying to identify these newspaper articles related to mining if the main topics of the news are mining. So it's like if during the first, because our data shows different number of topics in the same newspapers article. So maybe we have hundreds of of different topics. So we say, if we are discussing mining first, we keep it. But if you are discussing first something related with oil, we exclude, because we are trying to only focus on mining in this. But that's what we do.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you responded most of the questions. Just to say that you have, well, just to say that, yeah, in this case, we're using this as a control variable. So we are not looking then, I mean, then, so the plan in the next stage is to start to look then at the links between conflicts and some of these issues. But this is, as I said, it was a very short paper we developed for a special issue. We didn't have enough space. And also we didn't say, but we did that with very small piece of funding. And so actually this is much more, we've done much more work than the one paid. But so our idea is now get and to work much more on this data with proper funding. But what we did so then was to make sure that the estimations we're running, they were robust. But we know that then there will be a lot of questions to be explored in terms of the links between the democratic or not democratic and so on. And so, yeah, very interesting, many different type of questions, the dynamic, I mentioned, we are very interested in the dynamics, contagious effects, and issues like that. So, yeah, I don't think there was another question that I remember.
The only thing.
Yes.
So I wanted to add is this relation between cooperation and conflicts. Yes, I think that we discussed this a little bit, but the best way to deal with everything is, this is a negotiation. So in the negotiation with you have some conflicts, people are trying to get the power to their side in order to get some, and then you have some cooperation events. But it's very relevant for us is, maybe if you not tackle the problems at the very beginning in the right way, you screw up and you can continue cooperating.
Yeah, she had a question.
Thanks for the presentation. It was quite interesting. And I would like to know if you are going to look for the competition on this. I mean, there is conflict that could be fueled by competition, you know, the other ones that are going to lose something with it. Yeah. So maybe we are looking at the community's resistance, but they can be fueled by other ones, by competition. So I think maybe it would be interesting to have the position of the competitors around those conflicts.
Competitors?
Yes, the other industries that would be losing something by that one.
Okay.
If that one would keep growing.
Yeah. There's okay. There's another.
Was there another question? No. I had a related question to that point, which was, I was really interested in the working paper, the degree to which you drew out learning, which is essentially for the industry itself. And again, it's quite often this research kind of stops at the lived experience of the community. But actually you're saying this is going to cost industry and economies a lot of money if you allow these conflicts to become polarized. So it's kind of similar to yours. I was curious to know if we found ourselves, yourself in a meeting with a mining tycoon, what would you tell them about this? Because it seems to be that there is something in here for them as well, not just for those who want to empower the communities and support resistance.
Yeah, actually, the first time I presented previous work that wasn't with this data, but was with information on Chile, the first mapping, and in Argentina. And I went to Chile. I was the first time in my life that I went to a presentation and all the companies were there. It was BHP, Anglo American. They were all sitting in the room. Very interesting, taking notes, asking a lot of questions because they know. I mean, you can say something about that maybe, but so it was very interesting for me. They're very interesting because they know that something has changed. They don't know really how to deal with that. They said that it was Codelco, also the main Chilean mining company. It's state-owned, that is supposed to be more related to public good, but actually is one of the companies with most conflicts. So I think a lot of and the work, when we started, we were more interested in talking to policymakers, and because the lack of awareness, and something that I was, before coming to IDS, I was advising the Argentinian government on issues related to mining, and then the lack of awareness and recognition of the scale of the problem, and the lack of understanding of how to deal with it and how to change, how much really they have to, how radically they have to change, and they are not willing to do it. It was really striking for me. So I think actually the motivation of this work is very much to talk more towards companies and governments, showing that really it's not going to work what they are doing anymore than really to, because I think there has been a lot of work done more focusing on local communities and how to empower, and I think it's very important, but I think what is missing is precisely this, and I could perfectly see how policymakers are not, didn't, and even now in Chile with a very progressive government that I'm very much in touch with them, they're not, I mean, they don't know how to do it. It's not just that they don't recognize the problem, they don't know how to do it. It's a very difficult thing to do, because we can say, more participation, yeah, but how? How do you do it? I mean, it's very complex. It's not something that they're not equipped to do. So that's why I think we need to do much more research on how to do it in practice. But on the competition, if I understood well, I mean, there is some discussion in the literature about whether conflicts are more prevalent in areas where we have, or in situations where there is scarcity or abundance. And so, for example, in Mendoza in Argentina, which is a region of wine and very rich, the mining is forbidden. People say no because, and so people will say, okay, because you have alternatives. But actually, well, that's one case, no? But some of the research that I have, we didn't explore that, but we could perfectly explore that, and we will. But some research that I have seen also shows that it can also be the other way around, that in the poorest, where you have less competition with other activities, you still might have, like in the north of Chile, like, this in the desert, nobody reacts. No, yes, they react. And also resistance in this area. So it's not very clear for me what is the relationship, and it's something that we could explore a bit more. But also you can look at more, you can see livelihoods and what people is depending on and rich resources, but you could also look at industries, which industries, no, it's a very good point. Yeah, so no, there is somebody else, but, and also, yeah.
Another question at the back.
Then.
So I'm saying this because, as I've seen in Brazil, the pharmacy industry, they are so powerful. They can build up a whole community to fight off something that they want to. So maybe we should take a look on that as well.
Yeah. No, there are many.
Thanks so much. Actually, just following up on that, I feel like it's interesting if we look at it from the perspective of the communities, and that when no means no is violated and the movement's created,
It's just more slow.
yeah, sorry. If we look at this from the perspective of the communities, and no means no, and FPIC is violated, and a movement's created, that is resistance. But in the language, in the script of the investment companies, that's a risk. Right, to them, it's the cost to the operations, and this is political risk, and it creates a new category for them, which we need to buy more political risk insurance, and that creates a whole other speculative market that continues to dispossess, but does not actually tackle the root problem of dispossession that happens at the mine site in the first place. So I find the so what element of this research so interesting, because you can go so many different directions with it. Also including like when procedural justice becomes appropriated by these investment companies or mining companies. Yeah.
I know I've already asked a question, so I don't know if anyone else wants to go, but I just wanted to compliment both of those points, because because you've georeferenced the project, you can look at subnational issues. So, and the question of legal frameworks for subnational ownership of subsoil resources is relevant, but also the extent of regional political polarization and the extent to which national elites are perceived as aligned with transnational mining companies and therefore hostile to local interests as a variable. And it ought to be possible, I suspect, to pick that up within your data. So, yes, the government of Chile is a progressive government, but from the Atacama, maybe it does, maybe it looks like all governments are the same. Hay gobierno soy contra or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So if you have a perception of marginalization, and most of these deposits are in marginalized territories, indigenous territories, traditional territories, historically marginalized territories with a perception of colonization from within the state as well as externally, that would be a useful variable. Since you've got the georeferencing, you can look at regional inequalities, political and economic, as one of the follow-up bits of analysis.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah, and I think building on this, the geography of energy transition, and to what extent your data can also tell you if high polarization is a function of the project size or the embeddedness of the project community or the focality of it vis-a-vis other economic activities, right? Because you alluded to this point, right? If there's economic diversity, you might have less resilience because you might have overall economic resilience. But if you have dependency and you have a whole community built upon something, they might be even motivated to do something.
Yeah.
So because you are at the national level of analysis here, right? But
no,
I wonder
but
if
we can go local. Yeah.
a little bit lower, right? Because it will even tell apart whether there is, you know, a gap between big city activism, small city support, or if there's this kind of like non-locality of activism when it pertains to the same region of things. And I'm thinking Australia, right? Traditional owners and communities, there's a different degrees of engagement. Communities there, extractives, are also very active in trying to at least be perceived as being, you know, supportive. But from my own research, I've seen as well that there is this duality in engagement, right? The cooperation is something that we see a lot there, right? And even with some of the metal value chains, we see that kind of this, as you go towards the refined product, you see higher polarization and you see even more engagement. And that's something that the early stage communities, because of the economic benefit, is more tied to the local economy, you see less, right? So there's definitely something very interesting that I'm just wondering as well.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah. Well, a lot of ideas for research.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you think you might be able to respond to some of these points? I mean, you're obviously about to start work on the next phase, so.
Well, yeah, no, some of these things are, I mean, we do our best with the data that we can collect and put together with this one. There are so many questions that one would like to respond, no? But I think now the big challenge for us and the one we have been thinking on is about how to bring and cross this with other data sources to precisely address all these interesting questions, and we will have to prioritize a bit. And I think all of the comments and the issues raised here are among the things we've been thinking, but also some new interesting insights. So thank you very much. And but more specifically, I think yes, these issues, I mean, the legal issues, and we've been thinking about that, and the issue, of course, of how much the local economy, these are things that you automatically think, I mean, how much the level of development of the local economies, the possibilities of integration. But then in the cases, you see such a diversity of situations that to be able to go and look at these things with some theory behind and not just ask to the data like blank, I think we need to really think about it, because it's not, otherwise we'll be just, you know, running hundreds of regressions and correlations, but it's not what we want to do. We want to really link the work to some core discussions and probably put the focus there rather than trying many things. And that's my view.
Yeah.
Maybe you agree.
I mean, the only thing I would like to add, I mean, it's not related with the comments and question, but it's related with the data that we never say this, but it's important. It's like the data is so big. I mean, they provide chunks of 15 minutes since 2015 until now. So we've spent like 3 or 4 months with 2 computers working day and night all the time, just downloading the data, filtering, keeping whatever we think that is interesting and so on. So it's like, it was an automatic process, but we had to check several times and so on. So it's like, that's why we think that's why we get the publication that it was a very novel contribution, because just putting all this data together and realize that this making sense was a big contribution. So now we have to start exploring and also adding some more data. We have already some local level data to try different kind of correlations. Of course, the ideal thing in my way is to have a bigger team to be able to start checking more manually all the data points and on not all the data points, but do double checks and so on. So it's like it's still there's so much that we have to do.
Yeah,
we will do. But
we will do because
if
we
we
will
get
get
funding.
money.
Well, I think that's your pitch, isn't it?
Yeah.
For the centre.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
I think this is such it's such fresh research. It's fresh and exciting methodologically, and it's fresh and exciting in terms of the very strong findings that are coming out of it. And I mean, in a way, it's so great to hear that you have more data than you know what to do with, because this is a great argument in favor of further investment. And my one recommendation, if I may, would be to, even if your work will continue to be predominantly concerned with bringing in the perspectives of people in the global south, frame it universally, frame it globally, because it will extend your access to funding beyond the usual suspects, and it will. And at the end of the day, as you've said, many of these companies work transnationally and internationally anyway. So, you know, remain kind of with a global focus, because I think that makes this a really compelling offer, particularly now at a time when we're facing severe cuts to overseas development assistance, which will filter down to funding for research. But there are many other places to access research funding outside of the traditional development study space, and they will love this. So well done, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.